All right. Hello, everyone. Kunal Merchant, COO with Revitate Cherry Tree. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by Chris Marsh, the Senior Operating Partner for Revitate Cherry Tree, to talk a little bit about our multifamily housing fund and specifically our focus on workforce housing, which is a really important focus of the fund overall. So Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Kunal. Great to be here.
So for those, a lot of the folks watching understand what Revitate Cherry Tree and what our fund is, but just to get started, can you just give everyone kind of a quick summary of what we're trying to do with this fund and Revitate Cherry Tree overall?
You bet. Yeah, I think simply put, the fund strategy is focused on the acquisition of existing undersupplied workforce housing apartments in the middle of the country, and combined with the application of best-in-class asset management capabilities, we drive compelling returns for our investors.
And I know you have been really bullish on this workforce housing segment of the multifamily market. And people sometimes don't really understand exactly what that's defined as. Can you define what workforce housing is and also what it isn't?
You bet. And I'll perhaps start with the technical definition and then lapse into the more sort of recognized definition. So the accepted technical definition of workforce housing is housing for families typically earning between 60 and 120% of area median income for that particular area or location. So that obviously varies quite a bit from region to region, but it nevertheless is a good barometer when we think about the typical profile of a workforce housing resident. As a practical matter, and as far as apartment housing specifically is concerned, that tends to mean older vintage assets that were perhaps built in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that might otherwise be considered to be B or C communities, as opposed to the often newer Class A communities. So this sort of aging effect is being referred to, again, by some industry commentators as NOAA, which which simply means naturally occurring affordable housing. But I want to avoid the confusion here, because what it isn't, and thanks for the question, is affordable housing with a capital A, which is often characterized by rents that are subsidized by the government, often in communities that were built with government subsidy. So we can think of workforce housing, I think, most notably as not affordable housing per se with a capital A, but attainable housing by working class Americans and entry-level young professionals.
Got it. Very helpful. Thank you. And we just put out an insight blog recently on making the case for why workforce housing is a particularly good investment strategy, given everything that's going on in the world right now. And I think we articulated 3 specific benefits of investing in workforce housing. Can you walk us through those? And for the folks watching?
You bet. I think the 3 intractable benefits to this particular asset class and investing in this particular asset class are supply-demand imbalance, the resultant stability and reduced risk of that imbalance, and the competitive returns to investors that therefore provides. And let me unpack that a little bit as I get into each. So, firstly, supply and demand imbalance. Workforce housing assets are typically purchased between 60 and 70% of what it would cost to build new, or what's referred to in the industry as replacement cost. That effectively means that there's precious little new supply of competing product actually being built. Aside from the previously mentioned, government-sponsored housing programs, the cost of building new apartment buildings simply isn't viable. It's not a viable proposition at the rent levels that correspond to the older vintage assets that constitute the bulk of the workforce housing market. So think about that. And then in addition to that, you have this sort of further compounding effect on the supply-demand imbalance of older assets either falling out of economic use due to obsolescence, or, as has been the case certainly for the past few years, effectively being taken out of the marketplace by value-add strategies that seek, at their strategic level, to reposition the asset so as to appeal to a different renter profile, perhaps, and often at a different higher rent. both of these effects ostensibly means that the supply of workforce housing is inherently constrained. At the same time, and given the massive run-up we've all seen in rental rates nationwide over the past few years, the demand for more attainably priced housing has been higher. It's never been higher, frankly, and we see that as set to continue as this, affordability concerns prompts more and more families to seek cost-effective housing alternatives. So, as we all learned in Economics 101, when a supply-demand imbalance occurs, especially one that's not easy to remedy or quickly address, that tends to provide for a well-performing and stable investment over the long term. The second benefit, which is really a derivative of the first, is the inherent stability and therefore reduced investment risk that comes with that. Obvious perhaps to state, but when insufficient product exists to cater for current and certainly future anticipated demand, that bodes extremely well for that product remaining in high demand. Combine that with the lack of alternatives to obtain more cost-effective housing, more cost-effective than what is already the workforce housing category, and you have a very stable asset class, enjoying typically high occupancy rates, high retention rates from the people that it serves. That significantly increases stability, and it significantly reduces risk. And certainly relative to other apartment asset classes such as luxury or Class A and value add communities where people have to choose to pay more to live there. And by definition, on contrasting basis, they always have an option to pay less by living somewhere else. And that's oftentimes not the case with workforce housing. Finally, and again, just building on really the first two, supply-demand imbalance and the reduced risk and stability inherent in this investment class, is really our ability to produce, competitive investment returns. It's the best part. There's no need to sacrifice returns for all of this stability and risk reduction on a risk-adjusted basis. Workforce housing presents an incredible investment and one that's often comparable or frankly even superior to other multifamily property types. On the Revitate Cherry Tree portfolio to date, we're continuing to see solid cash-on-cash returns to investors in the mid to high single-digit range. We're able and seem set to deliver on our targeted investment return of 12% IRR over the life of the fund. And when you combine that with the aspects that I've mentioned of risk adjustment and inherent stability of the asset class, we believe that presents for a compelling opportunity for investors.
Excellent. Yeah. And you kind of touched upon this, but really to hit the point home, it's a really challenging economic moment for everybody just trying to understand where things are going. And it's incredibly fluid and there's a lot of uncertainty at all levels of the economic ladder. And as investors or advisors to investors, folks are trying to make smart decisions with a really challenging environment. What is it about workforce in particular in an era of inflation and rising interest rates that you think is comparatively promising? And I know you touched upon this earlier, but I think folks are really interested in this piece. What do I do, and what is my advice to people with the interest rates where they are and inflation where it is?
Well, there's no doubt these are challenging times, but as economic times become more challenging with seemingly persistent high inflation, and as we're seeing correspondingly in answer to that increased borrowing costs, the prospects for workforce housing investing continue to be extremely good. Multifamily has long been considered a solid inflation hedge. The bulk of the operating costs made up of the debt servicing costs are fixed at the time of purchase. And of course, inflationary environments tend to mean increased rents over time and therefore increased revenues over time. Combine that with a level of demand only set to increase as those very borrowing costs mean that fewer and fewer families can actually afford to purchase a home as an alternative. And you have the makings of a continued very healthy returns from workforce housing investment. So, frankly, in summary, we consider that this makes workforce housing investment truly the right product at the right time.
Okay, well, we thank you, Chris, for your time today. If folks are interested in learning more, please visit rev-ct.com. Again, Chris, thank you and best of luck as we move ahead on this fund.
Appreciate it. Pleasure.